You guys, vampires are back. And not as glittery soulmates or tragic bad boys, but as unsettling reflections of everything we're afraid to name. I'm Cammie, and this is Thanks I'll Take It From Here, the podcast where we break down the stories that stuck with us, the ones that nearly went somewhere bold, and sometimes the ones that still deserve a rewrite. Today, we're talking vampires, the fear they've always carried, the myths they've evolved through, and how Nosferatu and Sinners brought that fear back to the surface, and why Twilight, of all things, almost did too. I'll explore how Twilight could be revitalized to match this new era of vampire storytelling through the Volturi. So let's get into it. Before vampires had control issues, perfect cheekbones, and a habit for stalking emotionally neutral teenage girls, they were just rotting corpses with boundary issues and bad vibes. Vampires were born from fear of disease, outsiders, damnation, sexuality, and class rebellion. So vampires weren't just spooky, they were political, cultural, and deeply personal. In 18th century Eastern Europe, during outbreaks like tuberculosis, people saw loved ones wasting away and decided the dead must be feeding on the living. Like, that is the only logical explanation. So corpses were exhumed, and if they looked a little too preserved, like they were keeping it tight, they were assumed to be vampires. And of course, the church had to add its own little flair, and they said vampires were souls who hadn't received last rites or who had sinned in life, and because of that, they're able to walk again in the undeath. And if I'm being really honest, if the punishment for sins was immortality and preserved youth, I don't know if they really wanted to be preaching that, because I'd be like, where do I sign up? Is the sign up sheet in the back of the church? Where is it? But Europe wasn't the only place telling vampire stories, not even close. So let's talk about vampire lore around the world. In West African folklore, the Obayefo is a vampire-like being from the Ashanti traditions. It's a living person who leaves their body at night to feed on blood and energy, especially from children. The Ashan Bosham also comes from West African folklore. It lives in trees and has iron teeth and hooks for feet. Not exactly the kind of thing you would think is cute if it watched you sleep in your bedroom like Edward did in Twilight. Now, we're gonna leave West Africa and look at some lore in North America among the Wabanaki tribe. So in their folklore, they have something called the Sky de Gamooch, I believe is the pronunciation. It's an undead spirit believed to rise from the body of a sorcerer who died improperly. In Chinese folklore, the Jiangxi, or hopping vampire, is a reanimated corpse that moves by hopping stiffly with its arms outstretched. It drains life force, not blood, and is often dressed in traditional Qing dynasty robes. These creatures emerge when burials go wrong and the spirits get trapped or balance is disturbed. In Middle Eastern lore, they have something called the ghoul, or the ghula if it's in its female form. It's a shape-shifting demon that lives in graveyards and deserts, luring in people with its beauty before revealing its monstrous form. So across cultures, West Africa, East Asia, the Middle East, indigenous North America, and Europe, vampire stories didn't start necessarily with romance. They started with fear, but not just fear of death, fear of ritual breaking down, fear of impurity, fear of grief with no closure. Vampires gave people a framework in a chaotic world. But as stories moved from folklore to books, films, and TV shows, vampires didn't just survive, they evolved. So let's explore how vampire portrayals in film and TV have transformed, and how each version kind of reflects the world that shaped it. So it starts with Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, where the vampire isn't just a monster, he's a metaphor. A foreign threat invading Victorian society, seducing its women, corrupting its values. Then in 1922, we get Nosferatu. It's an unofficial German adaptation that made Dracula grotesque, a walking disease. This was post-World War I, post-Spanish flu, so people were afraid of sickness, collapse, and contagion, so the vampire became like the plague in human form. Then came Hollywood. Lugosi's 1931 Dracula put the monster in a tux. He was still dangerous, but he waited and he lured. By the 1950s and the 60s, Hammer horror leaned into gothic seduction, think blood on corsets, candlelight, and forbidden desires. The horror wasn't just in the bite, it was in what the bite represented. In the 1970s, things got louder. Blackula reframed vampirism through race and slavery. The monster wasn't just other, he was angry, and rightfully so. In 1983, The Hunger explored grief, queerness, addiction, all wrapped in velvet. It was a film about loneliness disguised as seduction. These vampires weren't metaphors for fear per se, they were metaphors for what society tried to silence and who society tried to silence. Then came Interview with the Vampire in 1994, and vampires didn't just kill, they mourned. It was grief, guilt, existential threat. Living forever meant watching everyone else die, and in a post-Cold War, post-AIDS world, this version hit hard with many people experiencing survivor's guilt. It wasn't just about monsters, it was about what it meant to survive when you didn't want to. Then vampires became a system. Blade and Underworld imagined vampires in boardrooms. It was structured, it was corporate. At the same time, Buffy showed us vampires were trauma. They were exes, shame, secrets. Every demon was a symbol. This wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about what society builds, buries, and tries not to name. In a post 9/11 world and a recession, the vibe shifted. We got Twilight, True Blood, The Vampire Diaries. They all showed vampires as restrained, moral, and broken. They didn't want to hurt you, they wanted to love you, and they hated themselves for it. These stories weren't about power, they were about control, because that's what we craved: control and chaos, rules, boundaries, even in monsters. Every vampire era tells us something about shame, about identity, about what we need monsters to be. They start as metaphors and end up as mirrors. And the evolution doesn't stop there. Recently, filmmakers have started peeling back the polish, trading the charm for dread. In Sinners, the vampire's allure is deliberate, seductive, yes, but also deeply unnerving. Its beauty is used as a weapon to explore power, oppression, and historical trauma. In Nosferatu, the horror is raw and it's stripped down and ancient. It's creeping, dread with no appeal, only presence. Both films strip fantasy in different ways, bringing the vampires back to what it's always been, a mirror for our deepest fears. So let's talk about how these films brought horror back to the vampire and what that says about us now. So Sinners takes us to 1930s Mississippi, a community gathering of a new juke joint. It's a celebration of music, black joy, and long-standing bonds, which are romantic, familial, and chosen. But beneath that joy is a long shadow of racial terror, loss, and survival. The vampires aren't the only evil in town. The landowner who sells the deed under false pretenses to the brothers is evil in another form. The juke was never meant to be a sanctuary, it was bait, it was a trap. So evil didn't arrive with the vampires in this film, but at least they had to be invited in to physically harm you. The vampire leader in this film, Remick, isn't after blood alone. He wants Sammy, or more specifically, Sammy's voice. Sammy is a beacon. His music carries history, defiance, grief, memory. That's what draws the vampires in. and that's what they want to possess. Remick isn't just feeding, he's curating, building a hive of beautiful things stripped of their soul. Sinners keeps classic vampire lore intact. Sunlight kills, blood sustains, scarlet hurts, silver slows them down, and yes, they must be invited in, which is exactly why I will never have a welcome mat, because if that counts as consent, I am not dying over a $12 rug. Also, side note, what if vampires invented welcome mats? Like, not as decoration, but like strategy to normalize the invite and make it cute. And suddenly every home with a welcome mat is an open door. And then the companies behind them would definitely be the same ones that were pumping out Live, Laugh, Love in like the mid-early 2000s during a recession. Because let's be honest, it would take something evil and deeply corporate to tell us to live, laugh, love during a recession. But I digress. So, in Sinners, Remick offers protection, power, immortality, but the price isn't just death, it's assimilation. In Sinners, the vampire isn't just a monster, he's a metaphor for cultural erasure, a colonizer cloaked in promises. This is horror rooted in being devoured, but then still smiling. And while Sammy may not set out to fight, his role becomes essential by standing firm in his identity and his music. He becomes the distraction that allows smoke to strike. Remick's desire for control becomes his undoing, because he gets so caught up in finally getting Sammy that he forgets the one thing he can't escape: the sun. Now, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is gothic dread at its purest. It's slow, silent, and suffocating. Count Orlok doesn't seduce, he invades, he creeps into your walls, your mind, your town. His ship carries thousands of rats and diseases that feel almost holy in its inevitability. And at the center is Ellen, a woman who in longing and depression awakens something ancient. She doesn't summon Orlok intentionally, but her pain echoes loud enough for him to hear. From the moment she touches his spirit, she's tethered. Convulsions, dreams, a voice not her own. He doesn't want just her body, he wants her recognition. To Orlok, Ellen isn't prey per se, she's proof he still matters. And in the end, it's Ellen who chooses to end it, not with a weapon, but with sacrifice. She gives herself over fully, and that's what kills him. Like Sammy, she becomes a distraction, and Orlok is so consumed with possessing her that he forgets the one thing he can't escape: the sun, just like Remick in Sinners. What ties Sinners and Nosferatu together isn't just tone, it's the metaphors. Sammy and Ellen don't lead battles with swords. Their strength isn't physical, it's symbolic. They're beacons, they're lures. Ellen's longing calls Orlok. Sammy's music calls Remick. And it's that desire, that fixation, that becomes the monster's weakness. In both stories, beings full of soul and history and desire is what makes you powerful, but it's also what puts you in the monster's sights. So I want you to keep that in mind, because it's something I'll carry forward in my Vulture pitch later when I talk about how Twilight can transition into the new vampire era. But before we get into that pitch, I want to talk about what is already canon and what we already know about the Volturi. Because the Volturi, they're not just vampire royalty, they're an empire built on fear and silence and curated power. The Volturi was founded over 3,000 years ago by Ero, Caius, and Marcus, not necessarily to protect vampires, but to control them. They made the rules, which was don't expose yourself to humans, don't create chaotic newborns, and don't threaten their power. And if you broke their rule, they disappeared you. But they weren't always in charge. Before them, the Romanian coven ruled. They were brutal and ancient, but they were disorganized. And Ero exploited that. And over centuries, he dismantled the Romanians piece by piece. In Breaking Dawn, we actually see two of the remaining elders from that coven, Vladimir and Stefan, who were still very bitter about what happened to their coven, and they saw the Cullens as an opportunity to take down the Volturi. Obviously that didn't happen, but it just goes to show you how brutal and strategic the Volturi was in dismantling that coven. So let's now run through the core Volturi roster. So there's Arrow, who reads every thought you've ever had by touch. He's obsessed with power and obsessed with gifted vampires. There is Caius, who doesn't really have a gift, but he is extremely ruthless and like obsessed with secrecy and control. And then there's Marcus, who can see emotional bonds. He's numbed after losing his mate Didymi, who was Arrow's sister, who Arrow actually killed so that he can keep Marcus loyal to him and their coven. Yeah, he killed his own sister. So that just really tells you the kind of person Arrow is. Then there's Jane, who can induce pain with the look. She's very sadistic, and she has a twin named Alec, who can nullify all your senses. And then there's Dimitri, who is the tracker for the Volturi. And there's Felix, who's like the muscle for the Volturi. And then Chelsea, who I think is like the most valuable asset to the Volturi, because she can manipulate emotional bonds, build loyalty, sever devotion, create devotion, and she's kind of what keeps the coven loyal to Arrow. So there's a few more people on the Volturi. They kind of have like their own guard, which is like their own army, and it's just made up of different vampires with different abilities, but these are kind of the core ones that I think are the most important ones. And together they rule from Volterra, Italy, behind human facades under centuries of secrecy. But their leadership isn't really leadership. It's more so conditioning. Like, they don't inspire loyalty, they enforce it. They don't punish chaos, they just control competition. Like, if you're too strong or you're a threat and you're gifted, like, it's either you join them or you die. They weaponize the rules that they create to dismantle covens sometimes so that they can pick off the most gifted vampire in that coven and force them to join the Volturi. They actually tried to do this with Alice and Edward. So now that we know a little bit more about the Volturi, I want to pitch my idea of how I would do a gothic horror Volturi spinoff. So picture this. It would take place decades after Breaking Dawn. Arrow becomes obsessed with legacy, power, and control after kind of being embarrassed and scared away by the Cullens. So he discovers that there's a pattern. Vampires born from trauma develop the rarest vampire gifts. So he starts to manufacture the pain and orchestrate tragedies to children, and then arrives as like this savior and white knight. And he basically promises these kids family and belonging and beauty and immortality if they join him. And, you know, like I said, he orchestrated their trauma. So to them, it's like this person's now coming to help them. They had no idea he was involved in whatever traumatized them. So when he presents what he is offering to them, he never says the price. And what the price actually is blind, unconsenting loyalty and servitude in an army that he's building. So he pretty much raises the kids in the school, and then when they turn 18, they are turned into vampires. And if their power is useful, they get to join the guard and get conditioned by Chelsea for servitude and loyalty. But if not, then he just kind of like, he disappears them quietly. So Violet is his masterpiece, right? In this kind of school that he has. And he named her after his sister's favorite flower. And even when Violet is a human, she sees emotions like colors, and she really believes that Arrow saved her and protected her. So she's protected and trusted, and she's never really conditioned by Chelsea or manipulated. She doesn't really need to be, because she just thinks Arrow is like the greatest thing since sliced bread. And Arrow likes that because finally there is this person who doesn't need to be manipulated to actually be devoted to him. But of course, that's until Violet begins to ask questions. So one day she feels something stir in Marcus, a name, Didyme. She asks Arrow what happened to his sister Didyme, and why is Marcus mourn her so intensely in silence, and why when she's asking Arrow about this, she can feel guilt radiating off him. And as we know, Arrow killed his sister, so that's why he feels the guilt, and he wants to keep that a secret. So that night he decides to send Chelsea to begin binding Violet and to stop her from asking questions. And shockingly, it doesn't work. But Violet pretends it worked. So finally we get to Violet's ceremony where she's turned into a vampire. After turning, everything kind of sharpens for her. She doesn't just see emotions, she sees lies behind them. She sees power and manipulation and secrets. And with a simple touch, she can reveal them and strip vampires of their powers. So with her new powers, she strips Chelsea and Arrow of their vampire gifts so they can't keep hurting people. And Arrow's empire begins to crumble. So I'm going to end it there. If you are interested in hearing more about this story, look on my socials. I will be posting follow-up posts about how the Volturi rebuilds after this. But I think this version of the Volturi and this spin-off from Twilight reflects this new era of vampire narrative where horror comes not from the bite, but from what it masks: exploitation, grooming, and silence. Because today, the scariest monsters aren't necessarily hiding in the shadows, they're running systems that we were taught to believe in. So that's it for today's episode. From ancient myths to modern monsters, vampires keep evolving, always reflecting something true about us, even when it's cloaked in horror. If you enjoyed the ride, subscribe, share, or leave a review. I'm Cammie, and this has been Thanks, I'll Take It From Here. Until next time. And remember to skip that welcome mat and never stop overthinking fiction.